have applause when you start, and you always hope that you might get some when you finish, too. It's an unusual custom to applaud so much for somebody before they even tell you what they're going to say, but I welcome it. I welcome it. We hear a lot in our country today about education, and of course the education system is somewhat deteriorating. The government takeover of it is making it worse and worse, and so there are private schools springing up and a lot of homeschool and everything. But there's a story about a mother that was having a terrible time getting her son to go to school, and she kept saying, "You've got to go to school, you've got to go to school." And he said, "No, I don't want to go to school. I'm sorry. No, I don't want to go to school." Well, she was getting pretty frustrated about this, and she kept saying, "You've got to go to school." And he said, "I don't want to go to school." He says, the teachers hate me, the students hate me, even the janitor hates me. I don't want to go to school. And she said, "But you've got to." And she kept after him, "You've got to go." And he finally said, "Well, give me 2 good reasons why I have to go to school." And she said, "All right, 2 good reasons. You're 45 years old and you're the principal." It's getting that bad. Then there's the story about the young fellow that went off to Sunday school, and he came home after the lesson and he said, "Oh, Mom, what a lesson we had today." And she says, "Oh, well, tell me all about it." He said, "It was really something." "Well, tell me." He said, "Well, it was about the Jewish people being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh's army, and they were heading towards Israel, and of course the Pharaoh's army was catching up to them, and it was getting pretty bad, and then they got up against the Red Sea, and they couldn't get across, and it was really looking bad for them, and the army was coming after them." He said, so Moses got on his walkie-talkie, and he called in the Israeli Air Force, and they came and bombed the Egyptian army, and then the Israeli Navy came across the Red Sea and picked them up and took them to safety. Wow, he says, it was really something. And she said, "Is that what they taught you at Sunday school?" And he said, "Well, no, Mom, but if I told you the way they told me, you wouldn't believe it." You see, the boy was skeptical about something he should have believed. And don't we in our country today have all kinds of people believing things when they should be skeptical? Well, I want to tell you some things today that I don't think you should be skeptical about. There's a lot of important information that we need to have in the hands of many more Americans, and so I'm very delighted to have a good-looking audience in front of me here tonight, and I hope what we have to offer makes a lot of sense to you. Let's start off with the positive foot, which I love to do, and tell you what we are trying to save, what we are for in this John Birch Society. We're for Americanism. We're for what our founding fathers gave us. We're for the greatest experiment in human liberty in all history, the United States of America. And it began, of course, with the Declaration of Independence. There's the philosophical base upon which the nation is built, specifically where it says men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Stop right there. How many nations began that way? There is a God, and it's from Him we get our rights, not from government. And they went on in the next breath to define what government's role is. They said to secure these rights, governments are instituted. God's on top, individuals next, government's on the bottom. How many nations have begun that way? No other. Fantastic foundation. Well, there's the Declaration of Independence. We're separating from King George. The King George sent his army, and he said, "No, you can't. You're not going to separate. We want to hold on to you." So we had a little war, didn't we? We had a war for independence. We won. We fought it under the Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation, and we won the war, and we sent the British packing back across the sea, and we who are of Irish descent are especially delighted about that. Well, then they got together in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation, and they threw them out. They got rid of them, and they came out with a whole new governmental system called the Constitution of the United States of America, and the whole Constitution is right here in that few pages, which means it could never have been written by government today. It'd be that high off the floor, wouldn't it? Right? Who does it limit? Does it limit you and me? You know that. No, it limits government. Specifically defined powers are given to government. And there's checks and balances and diffusion of powers and separation of powers, everything they could possibly think of to have government empowered in a very few areas. And then they sent it to the states for ratification. And some of the states said, you know, it would be better if we added to this a Bill of Rights. We don't want people to just presume what our rights are. Let's write them down. And so they added the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and here they are, right there, all 10 of them, men of very few words. What are the Bill of Rights? Well, it talks about freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the right to publish, the right to practice your religion, the right to keep and bear arms. But they had an interesting way of expressing these. They didn't say the First Amendment gives you the right to speak and publish and practice your religion, did they? They had already believed that the right had come from God. And so what did they say? They said, Congress shall make no law to take it away. We don't have First Amendment rights. We have God-given rights protected by the First Amendment. We don't have Second Amendment rights. We have God-given rights protected by the Second Amendment. Try to remember that. Don't get caught up in talking about First Amendment rights and so on. Explain to people that you really know what America is all about by saying it the way I said it. Now, I hear people telling me that the First Amendment is the most important because there's the right to the guarantee that they can't take away the right to speak and the right to publish and the right to practice your religion, and I hear people saying that, and I disagree. I think the Second Amendment's the most important. It gives teeth to all the others. Without the Second Amendment, how can you demand that government not suppress your right to speak and to publish and to practice your religion? And any move to disarm the people of this country by our government should be a signal to every person that that government is to be feared. And the right to keep and bear arms is not about target shooting and about hunting, and it's not even about protecting yourself from a burglar as much as it is protecting yourself from government. That's why there is a Second Amendment. The British marched out from Boston to Lexington and Concord to get the guns of the farmers, and the farmers said, if they mean to take our guns, they mean to take our freedom. It's very important. So there's what we're for. We're for what the American system is. We want to restore it. And you know, if we restored the Constitution to full force and effect, the government of the United States would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be wonderful? In addition to that, they gave us a cultural base, did the Founding Fathers. They were the churches. The churches were full. There were people who believed in God. They believed in the moral truths and the ethical systems handed down through the Scriptures. They believed very strongly in that. And consequently, they didn't need many laws. How many times do you hear today, we need more laws, there's more crime, we need another law, we need another stricture here, we need another something else here, we need more laws. Did you know that increasing numbers of laws is sign of a disintegrating civilization? Virtue is not advanced by written statutes. Virtue is advanced from within. And when a nation is godly, the nation doesn't need laws. Oh, there'll always be a need for some, of course. There are always some burglars or murderers or rapists or whatever. But as we turn away and as we outlaw God throughout our country, what do we find? We find more and more of this kind of conduct, don't we? They gave us a cultural base. And the great French political philosopher de Tocqueville came to our country 60, 70 years after it was formed. And de Tocqueville was just stunned to find the people in church and men in the churches, unlike in Europe. And he said, America is great because America is good. And if America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. How true. Now there's far more than enough people in this country who are still good. And what they've got to do is to ascend, and they've got to take leadership positions, and they've got to get rid of some of the current leadership we have that certainly is not good. Now there's something else about our nation too that I like to talk about, and it's the little Latin phrase that you see on coins and you see it on bills. It's the e pluribus unum, the Latin phrase, out of many one. And you know, some people say out of many what, one what. Well, out of many sovereign states, one central government, in a unique system where the states retain their sovereignty. And that's what they gave us. Very, very unusual. It is a unique system. So we see that when they formed the federal government, they formed it for just limited purposes, mostly for mutual protection, and the states were left sovereign. And the states could do whatever they wanted within their own borders. How many of the states set up a socialist or communist system? None. Why? Because of the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. E pluribus unum set up competition amongst the states to be the best state, to be the one where you'd want to bring up your family and start your business and live your life. And they knew that if they started a socialist or communist system, that people would simply get up and move to the next state. And the competition amongst the states made for excellence within our country. Competition will always do that. And today, what do we have? We have, instead of that, we have every state going down to Washington with the hands out for federal aid. And while there, they get the money and they get the handcuffs. And all of the states are giving up their sovereignty. And they're becoming fiefdoms of a central power in the building, totalitarian government. Completely overturning the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. Well, that's what we're for. We're for what the Founding Fathers gave us. But we're getting the opposite of it, aren't we? They're taking God out of the picture in many cases. And therefore, there's no God-given rights. You ask the 10 people you meet tomorrow, the first 10, where do you get your rights? If you get an answer at all, I dare say they'll say from government. But most of them will look at you and say, I don't know. Some of them will even say, I don't care. That's a problem. Well, we're losing national independence, centralizing government. We're heading toward world government, United Nations. They're building a world tyranny, in fact. We're turning on the heritage of the past. You know, all of us who live in this country did nothing to earn the privilege of being free. Unless you're an immigrant and you moved here. If you're a native-born American, you're just lucky. You didn't do anything except to be born here. But you have a responsibility to pass it on to the next generation. You have a responsibility to those who put their lives on the line, their sacred honor and everything on the line so many years ago so that you could be free. You can't just enjoy the fruits of freedom without responsibility to pass it on. That's what we're doing in the John Birch Society. We're trying to arrange to pass it on to our children, our grandchildren, and to generations yet to come. But America is turning on its past, and the Birch Society says it's not an accident. We dare to call it a conspiracy. And over the years, there have been a lot of people who talked about conspiracy without using the word. They hinted at it. Benjamin Disraeli, a British Prime Minister over 100 years ago, he said, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. Now that kind of smacks of conspiracy, doesn't it? A little bit of secrecy going on there. Franklin Roosevelt, of all people, said, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. We agree with that, too. That smacks of conspiracy. James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense in our nation in the late 40s, said, consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. Yeah, I kind of like that, too. Right? Again, you know, possible conspiracy. J. Edgar Hoover, 1956, wrote an article for the Elks magazine. Longtime Birchers will love this. This is what you run into. Even short-time Birchers and people who aren't in the Birch Society, you will run into this attitude. J. Edgar Hoover said, the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. Don't we run into that, huh? That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Well, who's carrying the ball for this conspiracy? Let's take a look at the President of the United States, Mr. Bill Clinton. He promised us a tax cut and he gave us a tax increase. He's piling up deficits that are going to lead to the brink of bankruptcy. He works feverishly to entangle us in NAFTA. Now he wants GATT, 2 victories for the enemies of national sovereignty and the New World Order. He and his unelected spouse plan to replace the world's finest medical care system with a type of government-run socialistic system that has failed everywhere else it's been tried. I heard a wisecrack the other day. Sometimes these wisecracks sum up things beautifully. A fellow said, if you think medical care is expensive, just wait till it's free. Boy, I say, just wait till it's free. Bill Clinton wants to place U.S. military units under the control of the UN, and he's done that in Somalia. He appointed militant homosexuals to high government posts and wants to overturn the ban against homosexuals in the military. He's given the nation a surgeon general who advocates drumming sex education into the minds of children in kindergarten, distributing condoms at junior high, making government-subsidized abortion everyone's right, and legalizing drugs. She's quite a gal, that Jocelyn Elders. Huh? Bill Clinton is leading the campaign to eliminate the right of all to keep and bear arms. He has established a Hitler-like National Service Corps, pushed for the start of federally controlled police, nominated criminal coddling judges for high posts in the federal judiciary. He fully supports the demands of environmental extremists. He's cooperated with imposing crippling controls on mining, grazing, foresting, and manufacturing interests all across our nation. In general, Mr. Clinton's every domestic initiative seeks to build the power of government over the American people, and his foreign policy is designed to lead the United States into the clutches of a world government under the United Nations. This is Bill Clinton. And so you might ask, how did he get to be President of the United States? Well, he has spent his entire adult life working his way into the inner circles of a powerful conspiracy determined to rule the world. He was introduced to its goals while he was studying at Georgetown University under Professor Carroll Quigley. When he accepted the Democrat nomination in 1992 at the Democrat convention, he mentioned Carroll Quigley as his mentor in his acceptance speech. And when he did that, every member of the John Birch Society across the nation went, "Whoa, did you hear what he said?" People called us. The phones jumped. Everybody was calling. "Did you hear it? Did you?" "Yes, we heard it. Thank you. You're very perceptive. Keep at your work." We're gaining on the rascals. Who was Carroll Quigley? Well, Carroll Quigley wrote a book. 1,350 pages of it. I carry this around with me. I call it Carroll Quigley's Revenge. I'm getting sloped shoulders. 1,350 pages. Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. The book came out in 1966. Bill Clinton was a sophomore at Georgetown. The book describes a secret society to rule the world. And Carroll Quigley, who talked about it at great length throughout this book, never called it a conspiracy because he didn't think it was evil. A conspiracy has three elements: secrecy, more than one person, and evil. If it's secret and it's more than one person, but it's not evil, you don't call it a conspiracy. And he honestly did not call it a conspiracy. He didn't think it was evil. He thought it was wonderful. In fact, he said that. The only difference of opinion he had with them, he said, was that they wished to remain secret. Where did it come from? Who hatched it? Where did it start? Well, this is only one element of a conspiracy. It was the element in Great Britain. And it started at Oxford University in 1870 under a professor named John Ruskin. John Ruskin took the campus by storm. And he filled all the students with the idea that they were the elitists, that they were the best minds and the best culture and so forth, and that they should rule the world. And his star pupil, the one who was most infected with those ideas, was Cecil Rhodes, the man who was wealthy then and then became fabulously wealthy with the help of the Rothschilds by going to southern Africa and exploiting the diamond and gold mines. And Rhodes' money was used to advance the goals of the secret society. Some of those purposes centered on the desire to federate the English-speaking people and to bring all of the habitable portions of the world under their control. I'm reading from the book here. They finally formed inner circles and outer circles, as every conspiratorial operation would. The inner circle was formed in 1891. The outer circles formed after the turn of the century. In Britain, they formed the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and in America, they formed the Council on Foreign Relations. Bill Clinton happens to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But Rhodes left money. He left money for scholarships, the Rhodes Scholar Program. Now, along the way, they talked about the fact that the failure of the American Revolution. Boy, that bristles me. I don't like that attitude at all. I don't think it was a failure. I think it was marvelous. But they talked about the failure of the American Revolution. Well, what was their overall goal? We go over to this page here, and I'll read to you their overall goal, and I'm glad you're sitting. Their goal was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. And I can never read that without saying to myself, wow, what an ambitious undertaking. To create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. That's what the Rhodes Scholar Program is all about. Now, Carroll Quigley wrote another book. He wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment. It was published after he died. And in the Anglo-American Establishment, he dwelled for a time on the Rhodes Scholar Program. And let me read to you what he said. He said the scholarships were merely a facade to conceal the secret society. Or, more accurately, they were to be one of the instruments by which the members of the secret society could carry out the purposes of Rhodes. Bill Clinton became a Rhodes Scholar. Bill Clinton came back to our country and became the governor of Arkansas. He was then invited to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And then he was invited to be a member of its stepchild, the Trilateral Commission. And in 1991, Bill Clinton went to Europe to a meeting of the Bilderbergers. I was with somebody today and I said, the Bilderbergers, and he looked at me and he, well, what's that? I said, it's not a sandwich down at the McDonald's, right? The Bilderberger movement was begun in 1954 by David Rockefeller and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands at the Hotel Bilderberg in Holland. And it was a gathering of the elitists from Europe and America, and they've had a meeting every year ever since with 1 year interruption. The people who go to it from America are, just ordinary guys like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the top media people in our country and educators and columnists and just ordinary folk, right? And the purpose of the meeting is to decide how the world should be run. And they never publish what they talk about. They hold the meetings at plush resorts. They take over the place. Nobody's in, nobody's out except their people. And at the end of the meeting, they go back to their countries. In 1991, Bill Clinton went to a Bilderberger meeting. And while he was there, he was showcased before the movers and shakers of the world. And he came back to the United States, and he was permitted to be the President of the United States. And that's the way it should be understood. He was permitted to become the President of the United States by them. Now, these organizations that this man has joined seek to rule the world. He has shown very clearly that their agenda is his agenda. Their goals for mankind are his goals. Their people are his people. He's filled the administration with them, and like them, he regularly plays loose with the truth. He masquerades as a patriotic American. He betrays his oath of office as if it never existed, and he works diligently to fasten the chains of totalitarian government around an increasingly less free American people. Bill Clinton, of course, never publicized his highly questionable connections during this campaign, nor did the media, nor did his opponents. A lot of those opponents on the Democrat Party, people who wanted the nomination instead of Clinton, Paul Tsongas, Harkin from Iowa, Bob Kerrey from Nebraska, Jerry Brown and Jesse Jackson, they could have, and they should have, even in their own interests, pointed out that if you choose Bill Clinton, you're going to get a duplicate of George Bush, because George Bush is also Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and Bilderbergers. But they didn't do it, did they? Voters needed and deserved that kind of information. Why? Why didn't even those candidates, opponents of Clinton, do so? Very simply, those Democrat candidates fear the power of these groups and hope that someday they might be welcomed into those same inner circles. What is that power? Well, as long ago as 1912, Woodrow Wilson wrote a book, became president in 1913, and in his book called The New Freedom, President Woodrow Wilson said that there was a power existing in his day. And here's exactly what he said. Some of the biggest men in the United States are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive that they'd better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Some of the biggest men in America are afraid of something. Yes, indeed. But the John Birch Society is not afraid to speak out about it. We not only spoke above our breath in it, we went to the housetops and we shouted it out from the roofs. And we did everything we could to get the people in America to hear us. And what did that power do in response? Well, it labeled us fascists and crackpots and kooks, like the Nazis, like the Klan, anti-Semites, racists, everything nasty you could think about. And there are many Americans today who still harbor those notions and don't know why. And don't know why. Well, the Democrat aspirants aren't alone in fearing this power. Most of the leaders of the political parties, both of them. So do most of the prominent reporters, analysts, commentators, educators, corporate giants. They not only don't speak about it in whispers, they don't speak about it at all. They don't they don't spend deserved attention either on Mr. Clinton's numerous character flaws. It took a U.S. Army general named Harold N. Campbell to point out at the eventual cost of his career that the nation's president was a pot-smoking, gay-loving, draft-dodging, and womanizing commander-in-chief. Wouldn't you like to meet that man and shake his hand? Yeah? The horror here isn't that an American general was so disrespectful. The horror is that everything he said is true. Now, had any one of these serious personal deficiencies existed in a candidate for high office who is not connected to the conspiracy, the media would have had a field day, wouldn't they? They would have derailed any challenge that could have been made to the conspiracy's power. But you know, bad as these character flaws are, they are minor compared to the agenda that Mr. Clinton will carry out at the behest of his equally corrupt conspiratorial bosses. Every once in a while, something comes along that corroborates what we're talking about in the John Birch Society, and it comes from an unusual source. Here's an article that appeared in the Washington Post, which is a Council on Foreign Relations organ, no doubt about it, written by one of their own writers, Richard Harwood. It's called Ruling Class Journalists, October 30, 1993. And it talks about the Council on Foreign Relations. It says it's the ruling establishment in the United States. And here's what it says. The President of the United States is a member, so is his Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, all 5 of the undersecretaries, several of the assistant secretaries, and the department's legal advisor. And the President's National Security Advisor and his deputies are members. And the Director of Central Intelligence and all previous directors and the chairman of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board are members, and the Secretary of Defense, 3 undersecretaries and 4 assistant secretaries are members, and the secretaries of the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Health and Human Services, and the Chief White House Public Relations man, David Gergen, are members, along with the Speaker of the House, Foley from Washington, and the Majority Leader of the Senate, Mitchell from Maine. That's all there. Right? And then he went and talked about the media. Talked about his own newspaper, the Washington Post. He said amongst the people at our paper who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, we find the editorial page editor, the deputy editorial page editor, the executive editor, the managing editor, the foreign editor, the national affairs editor, the business and financial editor, and various writers, as well as Catherine Graham, the paper's principal owner. I'm surprised the janitor's not here. Right? Then the Washington Post. That's the Washington Post. How about the New York Times? Oh, the executive editor, the managing editor, and the foreign editor of the New York Times are members, along with the executives of other such large newspapers as the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, and the weekly news magazines, and the network television executives and celebrities, Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and Jim Lehrer, and various columnists, Krauthammer and William Buckley and George Will and Jim Hoagland, and on. It's amazing. It's all there. But he never condemned it. What he's doing here is simply telling aspiring young conspirators that this is the route to power. This is the route for you to follow in order to get yourself into the inner circles. If you write to the Council on Foreign Relations and you ask them, why are you doing this and why are you standing for, they will write back to you and they'll say, we don't take positions. We entertain all views. We don't select anyone. We ask people from all different kinds of views to come and present their points of view. It's just a talking shop here. We never take a stand. Did they ever invite me to speak there? No. But even this man countered that. He said they do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy, they help make it. Absolutely interesting. We're glad to have that little piece of corroboration. So Bill Clinton has all of these credentials. Council on Foreign Relations. 1973, David Rockefeller leading the Council on Foreign Relations, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, they got together and they formed the Trilateral Commission. 1 year before they actually formed it, they went to Europe to a Bilderberger meeting to present what their ideas were. It was approved by the movers and shakers of the Western world, and they came back and started the Trilateral Commission. And its purpose is to bring us into the New World Order via economics, while the Council on Foreign Relations is to bring us into the New World Order via the political realm. Not that they don't switch and traipse into the other's domain as well. They do. And Bill Clinton is a member of the Rhodes Scholar Program, and he's a Bilderberger. And the New World Order is what they want. The New World Order is two elements: political control and economic control. Political control through world government. Economic control through socialism. Not sociability, socialism, which is economic control of the people by government. Now, over the years, I've done many radio shows. I was happy to do one here today in Oklahoma City, and maybe there are some people here because of that program. If so, welcome. We're glad to have you. The talk shows that I've been on in recent years quite frequently would start off with somebody saying, well, today we have a guest from the John Birch Society, Mr. McManus, welcome. I have a question for you. What's the Birch Society doing now that communism's dead? They usually laugh, right? And I say, wait a minute, what do you mean communism's dead? What about China? What about Cuba? What about North Korea? What about Berkeley, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts? Well, communism, it still exists in some place. You're right, that, Mr. McManus. I said, of course, the USSR always stood for the Union of Soviet Communist Republics, didn't it? No, it didn't. It stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And I'll let that sit for a few seconds and say, aren't you going to ask me to define socialism? Oh, yeah, Mr. McManus. What's socialism according to the John Birch Society? I said, it's economic control of the people by government. It's taxation, regulations, controls, bureaucracy, big brother. And before I finish, invariably, the talk show moderator would at that point say, well, that's what we're getting here. And I said, thank you very much. You've made my case. Now you know why the John Birch Society is still in existence. We've always been opposed to that. Yes, we're anti-communist, but we are also anti-socialist, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, anti-any form of totalitarianism. And sometimes they then say to me, okay, what's the difference between a communist and a socialist? Right? We're getting real serious now. Right? I say, well, a communist is a socialist in a hurry. That's all. A communist means to impose socialism on you. And in doing so, he immediately develops resistance among 98% of the population, and he has to have gulags and KGBs and secret police and terror and knocks on the door in the middle of the night. But a socialist will get you to vote yourself into the condition and destroy resistance along the way. In many ways, the socialist is more dangerous. And that's what's happening to America. We don't face a communist takeover. We face socialism from within. Half of the New World Order, while George Bush was touting the United Nations and telling everybody he wanted a New World Order. Well, how do you get Americans to give up the liberty that we have in this country and go for this New World Order? The greatest experiment in human liberty. Nobody's ever lived as free as an American in all history. Not only that, we live better than the kings of all of the earth up until 50 years ago. Every one of us. How do you get people to give that up? You scare them. You scare the wits out of them. But first of all, you buy some of them And a lot of them have been bought, haven't they? A lot of Americans are on the government dole. A lot of corporations are on the government dole. You corrupt some, you corrupt somebody and you can get them to do your will. It's always been a tactic of a conspiracy. But as I said, mainly you scare people. And the greatest scare in my lifetime, and yours as well, has been communism. They even had a slogan to help scare you, and it was better red than dead. Remember? Better red than dead. Oh, there's great alternatives. Boy, yeah, which one are we going to choose? You can live under communism or you can be an ash in a nuclear holocaust. Are there no other alternatives? Well, how about, let's stay free. Let's retain our independence. Let's stop helping the communists to build the missiles that they're aiming at us. You see, that's the key to understanding communism in the last generation or two. The key is to understand that everything those communists were aiming at us, those missiles, those A-bombs or whatever they had on them, were made in the West. We gave them the technology, we gave them the equipment, we gave them the money, we gave them the computers, we gave them everything that they needed so that they could build a weapon to scare us into accepting more government at home and total government throughout the world. Better red than dead. And the Birch Society kept telling people about this, and we reached millions of Americans with this information. And so the resistance to communism remained. It was a fraud. It's still a fraud. And I don't mean to say that it's not there and couldn't come back. It could come back tomorrow. It could come back from Red China tomorrow. I think sometimes that Red China is being held in reserve in case they need that scare once more. They're scaring us now into sending more foreign aid over to Russia with a creep named Zhuravinsky. How does he say his name? Zhuranovsky. Thank you. Right. Zhuranovsky, about 6 or 8 years ago, was an opponent of Gorbachev and was touting free enterprise and anti-communism. Is this guy for real? No, this guy is a great actor. He'll do anything to attract attention to himself. He'll now try to be a militant communist. He'll try to be a friend of the Nazis. But he's being used to scare us into saying we've got to help Yeltsin. Why should we help Yeltsin? He's a socialist. We're not helping the Russian people. The Russian people, you know what they need most? No foreign aid. They need to be left alone. Well, the communist scare didn't work. And you know they never bank on just one thing. They always have some other tactics. There are several different things going on all the time to get you to give up your liberty. And the next scare is environmentalism. You know about that. Global warming. Global warming is because you're burning too much fuel in your automobiles and your factories and your homes, and all of this is putting up smoke in the atmosphere, and it's forming a canopy over us, and all the heat that's generated in the earth is not going off into space, and it's building up, and so we're going to have a lot more heat, and pretty soon the polar ice caps are going to melt, and the sea level is going to rise, and you're going to have beachfront property here in Oklahoma City. Now, that's a little bit extreme, but so are the claims of the environmentalists. Right? Global warming is a complete and utter fraud. Anybody who tries to peddle global warming up in the Midwest and the Northeast this year is going to be laughed right out of town. Right? There have been temperature readings taken for 100 years, 60,000 stations every single day, all around the world, and the data is available. And it shows no warming and no cooling. And yet they continue to tell us that we have to fear global warming. And it transcends national borders, because what we do here affects Canada, and it affects Mexico, and it goes across the polar regions, and it affects Norway and Denmark and Iceland and Sweden, and we better stop, and there has to be international controls to make sure you don't burn stuff in your factories and in your homes and in your cars and so on. We have to give up our sovereignty because of global warming. Isn't that the argument? And if it's not global warming, it's holes in the ozone layer. Or it's the rainforest in Brazil. Or it's who knows what. We've got to protect the endangered species. And therefore, we've got to shut down the logging interests. We've got to shut down this. We've got to shut down that. I heard a story recently about a fellow who killed a condor in California, and he was arrested by the authorities, and they were about to throw him away for life imprisonment or something, I don't know, for killing a condor, an endangered species. And he got to trial, and he said to the judge, "Judge," he says, "there's extenuating circumstances. Will you please let me plead my case?" "All right." He says, what's your story?" He says, "Well, I was out and I was hiking in the woods. I got lost." And he says, 3 or 4 days before I finally found, I saw this condor, and I threw a rock and I hit him. It was a lucky shot, and I cooked him up and I ate him. It saved my life. He says, "It took me 3 or 4 more days to get out of the woods, and then they arrest me, and now I'm here because I killed that condor that saved my life. Judge, be lenient, will you?" And the judge said, "Oh, all right. We won't send you up for life, but you got to do 15 years. And lead him off in chains. Right? And as he's going out of the courtroom, the judge yells at him, and he says, "Say, tell me," he says, "what did that condor taste like?" Well, he says, "Oh, Judge, it was about halfway between a bald eagle and a spotted owl." Environmentalism is destroying our country. Now, I'm an environmentalist, and I think every one of you are. Also environmentalists. You don't want to breathe dirty air. You don't want to drink foul water. You don't like driving down the highway and seeing trash all over the place, or even going for a walk and seeing it. But you don't have to give up your national sovereignty to fight that. And that's what they intend. And you know, this is long planned part of the conspiracy. Beginning in 1962, 15 individuals met on and off for a period of 3 years at a little place north of New York City called Iron Mountain. And they talked about developing an alternative to the nuclear weapon fight to get the people to give up their sovereignty. One of the men at the meeting, after 3 years, they put out a report, and one of the men thought it was so wonderful he took it to a publisher and they published it. He's the only one we've ever known has been at the meeting. That was John Kenneth Galbraith. So the report from Iron Mountain came out. It's very interesting reading. But I just want to read one sentence. It says here, "It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species." There it is. 1965. Launched the environmental hysteria movement. And note that they even said it is the principal apparent threat. They admitted that it's a fraud. Well, the environmental threat isn't taking as much as they wanted it to take. Happily, there are a lot of scientists who are speaking out and saying, no, this is ridiculous. This is absurd. Scientists usually speak to each other in their journals, but now they're talking to the public, and thank goodness they are. And so environmentalism isn't taking as much as it might. There are plenty of environmental groups, though, that are carrying the ball for the communists and the socialists and the enemies of freedom. I like to point to the Communist Manifesto, which we've published, and we want people to read it. And if you read it, you'll find Karl Marx, when he wrote this in 1848, summing it up. He said, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." There it is. Now, this is the Bible for every communist, but also every socialist. And they fought over who owns it and whose group Marx was a part of. All right, abolition of private property. The head of the Audubon Society recently stated, "We reject the idea of property rights." There you are. Is the Audubon Society promoting Marxism, economic control of the people? Yes. Well, how about the World Wildlife Fund? How about the Sierra Club? How about Jacques Cousteau and his little swim fins and his bubbles and his little boat? He's involved in it too, ladies and gentlemen. It can be shown. Well, environmentalism has to be watched. I don't mean to discount it. I say it's a very severe problem, and we've got to be careful. So what's the next threat? Well, the next threat isn't bogus. Communism is a fraud. And environmentalism is a hoax. But the next threat is not. The next one is debt. The national debt of the United States of America. It's now $4.5 trillion, which is meaningless, isn't it? What's $1 trillion? Well, how about if we just think about I owe $1 trillion, and I decide I'm going to pay it off. I'm going to pay it off at the rate of $1 million a day until it's finished, without any interest payments. Do you know it would take me 2,740 years? That's $1 trillion. And there's $4.5 trillion admitted debt right now. We are paying $300 billion in interest on that. And again, that's meaningless. What does that mean? Well, there's 250 million Americans, so do a little long division, and you come up with $1,200 for every man, woman, and child in the United States just to pay interest on the national debt every year, and it's going up. But not everybody's a taxpayer. In fact, only about half, so double it for taxpayers. $2,400 per year per taxpayer in the United States of America, just for interest on the national debt. That's $200 a month. I had an old friend up in northern New Hampshire I used to go visit every once in a while, and I don't know, 15 years ago he said to me, what's going to happen here is the government of the United States is going to spend us into great amounts of debt. And that's going to require borrowing. And the borrowing is going to require interest payments, and the interest payments are going to be taken from the American people in taxation, which means the government is gaining control over you because they started the debt in the first place. He said debt to borrowing to interest to taxation to control, and he was absolutely right. Absolutely right. Right now we face a $200-300 billion deficit. President Clinton vows that he's going to... Look, Clinton vows more trims in spending. That's about as good as his marriage vow. You know, I contend that if you went to a fourth grader and you said, $300 billion in debt this year, should we give away money? The fourth grader would say, no, you dummy. I think we need fourth graders in Congress because we still have a foreign aid program. We have a $13 billion foreign aid program. We have a $25 billion Commodity Credit Corporation program, which is another form of foreign aid. They give money to foreign governments to buy American goods, then they cancel the debt or they give them more money to pay it, roll it over. But the worst of all forms of foreign aid is when we station troops in foreign countries and accept their defense budget. We have troops in Japan. Japan's an economic giant. We have troops in South Korea. South Korea has become an economic giant. We have troops in Germany. They're an economic power. We have troops in the Middle East. We have troops in Macedonia. We have troops in Somalia under UN command. We have troops almost anywhere in the world. And this is a huge expense. Not only is it a huge expense, but the jobs are going overseas. They closed down bases here in the United States, didn't they? And where are those jobs now? Overseas. Somebody else has got those jobs. What does the John Birch Society say? Very simple, folks. Bring the troops home. Bring them home. I was on a call-in show one day and I felt we were debating this business of the closing down the bases. And he said, well, what's the Birch Society's position on this? I said, well, we're very much in favor of closing down the bases. Yes. I'm surprised. He says, I thought the Birch Society would be in favor of keeping all the military bases open. I said, well, you didn't ask me where. You didn't ask me which bases. Oh, he says, well, which ones? I said, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Middle East, Somalia, bring the troops home. Oh, he says, oh, you're an isolationist. I said, call it what you want. I like to call it America First. And there's nothing wrong with being America First. Our military is for one purpose and one purpose alone, to protect the vital interests of the United States. And if the vital interests of the United States are threatened anywhere in the world, we can have troops there overnight, can't we? Bring them home. Because if we don't bring them home, they will continue to turn them over to the United Nations. Should Poland have a seat in NATO? Yes. Give them ours. Right? But Clinton keeps telling us he's cutting spending. They keep saying it's government's function to create jobs. So we're going to tax the people. We're going to take money from the people to create jobs. You see, the last thing on earth the people would do if you left the money with them would be to create jobs. Right? So we've got to take it from them, and we've got to create the jobs. Isn't that absurd? Isn't that absurd? All that many good people in this country need is somebody to just point to these absurdities. And after you see several absurdities, piled on several more absurdities, then people say, wait a minute. They think of James Forrestal's quote, or they arrive at the same conclusion he did. If they were all mistakes, they would have made a few in our favor. Right? Consistency is not a quality of stupidity. Now they want national health care. National health care, right. If you think it costs a lot, wait till it's free. Right? Over in Boston, they have an annual tradition. The head politician from Nova Scotia shows up in Boston every Christmas season and brings a Christmas tree. It's a very nice tradition. They call him the Premier. A Canadian governor is not a governor, he's a Premier. That's what they call him. So the Premier of Nova Scotia came to America, came to Boston just before Christmas, and he brought a great big Christmas tree. They put it up on Boston Common. It's a nice thing. And this year it turned out to be a newly elected Premier of Nova Scotia, a medical doctor. His name is John Savage. And he came to Boston, and while he was in Boston, he kept saying to anybody who would listen, don't do to yourself what we have done to ourselves. He talked about socialized medicine. He said politically and financially, it has become impossible for us to continue. Well, they mean to do it, don't they? They mean to saddle us with that. And when Hillary Clinton went before the Congress of the United States to talk about her plans for us in the area of medical care, she said, of course, it's going to cost money, and there will be a lot of corporate and businesses will have to take care of it, and on and on and on. And some of the congressmen pointed out, you know, Mrs. Clinton, if you load that expense on small and medium-sized businesses in this country, you're going to destroy a lot of them. They're not going to be able to function. They're not be able to continue. And you know what she said? She said, I cannot be responsible for saving every undercapitalized entrepreneur in America. She should have been tarred and feathered and run out of this country. Imagine that. They don't intend to cut the deficit. They don't intend to pay off the debt. They don't intend to reduce our tax burden. They don't intend to allow us to be free. They mean, in fact, to make us their slaves. Which brings me to my book, Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy. I can sum it up in three sentences. The national debt is horrendous and deliberately brought about. And the second sentence is that the interim goal is to create financial chaos, financial terrorism, so that they can come forward with the third of my points, which is their ultimate solution, a world monetary system, world government, the New World Order. And it's all here in the book. They've told us what they mean to do. Statements from many of them are here. Here we have Brzezinski in 1970 saying more intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken. We have Richard Nixon saying the United States will join with other nations to have a modern world economic order by reforming the world monetary system. We have Paul Volcker of the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, saying the standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. You're a good fella. And isn't the standard of living declining? Can you pick up a newspaper from week to week in our country today without reading about some huge corporation in our country laying off 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, 2,000? Oh, it's almost a daily occurrence, isn't it? Where are those jobs going? They're going overseas. They're going overseas. And people say, well, we're still very wealthy in this country. There are a lot of people who think wealth is a table full of stocks and bonds and whatever. It's not. No, wealth is productivity. And that nation is a wealthy nation whose people take the raw materials of the earth and fashion them into goods. It's manufacturing base that makes wealth. It's all going overseas. And the U.S. is coming down, and other nations are coming up, and pretty soon we'll be mergeable into the new world order. Is it being done deliberately? Absolutely, my friends. Absolutely deliberate. We've got plenty of statements. And then we have statements of others who say, look, this is their goal. Jeremiah Novak in 1977 wrote an article in Atlantic magazine. The Trilateral Commission's most immediate concern, he said, is the creation of a new world monetary system to replace gold and the dollar. That's, 17 years ago. We've said it. Barry Goldwater said it in his book. Gary Allen said it in None Dare Call It Conspiracy, 1971. Jesse Helms' famous speech he read in 1987. He said it. So it's there. There's the plans. And you're going to hear more of that. And when you hear anybody talking about economic, monetary control, realize that that's what the goal is. And as the dollar continues to sink in value, that's what they'll come forward. Now, what are they spending the money for? All right, prepare to be infuriated, as well as seeing absurdities one after another. $2 million to study why truck drivers lose alertness at the wheel. I could have saved them $2 million. They get tired. That's why they lose alertness at the wheel. $49 million for a rock and roll museum. The taxpayers should pay for that? No. $500,000 to study the effects of cigarette smoking on dogs. $225 for an onion storage facility at the University of Georgia. Boy, I guess you can store a lot of onions in that place. Right? $500,000 to McDonald's Corporation to promote Chicken McNuggets. Can you imagine? $2.3 million to the Gallo Brothers to promote wine. Here's one that gets me. $1.2 million for African elephant conservation. I'm perfectly confident that that was put in by Republicans. They like elephants. Yeah. $11 million for the United States Institute for Peace to teach the people in our country to want peace. Ladies and gentlemen, the people want peace. It's governments that start wars. They send the people to fight and die in them. If they spent the $11 million to teach governments not to start wars, it might be worth it. $34 million for the National Fertilizer Research Center. They ought to locate that on Capitol Hill. Absolutely. I've got a chapter in the book where I talk about false alternatives, and I start off with a quotation from Shakespeare. In The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare said, "There's small choice in rotten apples." Well put, Will. Well put. What are the rotten apples? Either debt or world control of the monetary system. Are there no good apples to choose? Well, how about freedom? How about less government, pay off the debt, retain our sovereignty, and so on? There's good apples. Let's choose those. In fact, that's all one apple. I've got chapters in here about inflation. We hear all the time about inflation may be coming back. Inflation may be a problem. We're holding it to 2%. We're holding it to 4%. And what they're talking about isn't inflation. They're talking about the rise in the consumer price index. That's not inflation. Saying that the rise in prices is inflation is like saying wet streets cause rain. But wet streets don't cause rain. Wet streets are the effect of rain, and rising prices are the effect of inflation. And inflation is an increase in the quantity of currency. When you increase the quantity of currency, then all currency that anybody holds becomes less valuable. And everybody who shops and goes to the supermarket week after week knows that every time they go, they get a little bit less for the money that they spend. And certainly from year to year, you know that. I can remember buying a loaf of bread for a dime. It now costs $1.30. The bread costs the same amount of money. The difference is the value of the money isn't as much. That's inflation. Now, who causes it? Well, two elements cause it. Those who legitimately inflate the currency and those who illegitimately do it, the counterfeiters. And those who do it with legal power go after the counterfeiter. They don't want any competition. Inflation is one of the great techniques of stealing that has ever been devised. I tell in my book about a man who inherited $10,000 in 1940, and he could have bought a nice home for it, but he didn't. He put it in the bottom drawer of his bureau, and 50 years later he took out his $10,000 and he couldn't even put a down payment on a house. Where did that value go? It was stolen in a process that socialist John Maynard Keynes said, not one man in a million can figure it out. But inflation not only steals, it destroys. I've got a chapter in here about the criminal destruction of sound money. I've been told by people who read the book they found this most interesting. I've got pictures of different forms of currency that we've used. Here we have a gold certificate. And it's a U.S. Treasury note, and it says on it that this note is redeemable for gold on demand. And you could take it and get gold for it. And it was gone as of 1933. And then the silver certificate's again issued by the U.S. Treasury, and it says payable to the bearer on demand silver. And you could get real silver for it until 1968 when Richard Nixon took us off the silver standard. And then we have the first of the Federal Reserve notes, and that came out back in the late teens and early 20s. And it, because it was circulating side by side with gold certificates, said on it, redeemable in gold. And you could take it and get gold for it. And the American people were persuaded that, well, Federal Reserve note, U.S. Treasury note, they're equally good. And people became used to using Federal Reserve notes. Well, then Roosevelt took us off the gold standard, so the next one they came up with was, it said redeemable in lawful money. And there was a fellow who took a $50 bill one time into a bank, and he went up to the teller and he said, young lady, I'd like some lawful money for my 50. And she looked at him kind of quizzically and she said, do you want 10 fives or 5 tens? And he said, no. He said, if you look on what you want to give me there, it too says redeemable in lawful money. And if it's redeemable in lawful money, it can't be lawful money. I'd like some lawful money, please. And he smiled, and she said, just a minute, and went and got the boss. And he came out, and they haggled for a little while, and the man said to him, finally, he said, well, sir, what is it you really want? And he pulled out a little copy of the Constitution, and he said, I'd like gold or silver, like it says here. Am I going to get that? And they said, no. And he said, well, good, give me back my 50. You've proven my point. And out the door he went. So the next Federal Reserve note, the last of the 5 in the pictures, says on it, the ones you have in your pocket and purse today, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, redeemable in nothing. And in my lifetime, plus 2 years, we have gone from the finest paper money the world has ever known to totally irredeemable paper, backed by nothing, issued by a private entity called the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve, private entity? You mean it's not government? That's right, it's not government. It's no more government operation than is Federal Express. Just because it says federal doesn't make it a government entity. The Federal Reserve, where'd they get the idea for that? Well, we go back to the Communist Manifesto again, and we see the famous 10 planks of Karl Marx here on page 25 in this edition, and the number 2 is the heavy progressive income tax, and we got that in 1913, and that's where it came from. And then we see number 5, it says centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. And that's the Federal Reserve. Except that our people went one step beyond even what Marx said. It's not in the hands of the state. It's in the hands of a private entity called the Federal Reserve that has the power to inflate the currency and therefore to determine its value, has the power to set interest rates, has the power to create a boom, has the power to create a bust, can do whatever it wants at any time. And of course in the newspapers, just even the last few days, you're seeing that Greenspan, who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and the head of the Federal Reserve, says, I think we're going to have to raise interest rates. And President Clinton says, no, don't do that. And they're arguing, no, I should decide. No, I should decide. Ladies and gentlemen, neither of them should decide. It should be decided by the marketplace. That's what freedom is. That's what we've got to get back to. You know what can happen? Well, they can inflate the currency and create a little bit of a boom and help a politician to get reelected. They can contract the currency and create a little bit of a recession and hurt a politician. Do they ever do that? Yeah, they do that. In 1988, a man named Monroe Carmen wrote an article in U.S. News and World Report. This was just prior to the 1988 election, Dukakis and Bush, and he said, the central bank wants to strike a pose of neutrality for the contest between Bush and Dukakis. The Fed will neither plunge the economy into a recession, as Fed Chairman Volcker did in 1980 to sabotage Jimmy Carter's chances, nor open the money spigots wide, as Fed Chairman Arthur Burns did in 1972 to help Richard Nixon win the election. Can you imagine a few people with that kind of power? What's to do about the Federal Reserve System? Should we get the right people to run it? No. Let's abolish it. Let's go back to precious metal-backed currency issued by the United States Treasury, and no more fooling around, no more inflation. That's what has to be done. You know, there was nothing the Founding Fathers feared less than they feared paper money. They had experienced paper money in the Continental Congress issuing it. It gave rise to the expression, not worth a continental. If you're old enough, you remember that, as I do. I'm old enough, right? We, as I said before, we occasionally get some help that we didn't expect. I have a copy of the National Geographic magazine, and I didn't take it out of my briefcase, but I have it January 1993. And there's a long article there by a man named Peter White, and he's talking about the power of money. He's talking about all the different kinds of money that are used throughout the world, and even in our own country. And he goes around, and he finally goes to the Federal Reserve. Now here's what happened. White explains, after learning that the Federal Reserve has just purchased $100 million in United States Treasury bills. So he says to the Fed official, where did you get the money? And the Fed official says, we created it. It's money that didn't exist before. Wouldn't you like to do that? Huh? Is there any limit on that? No limit, only the good judgment and conscience of the responsible Federal Reserve people. Sleep well. Where did they get this vast authority? And the Fed official says it was delegated to them in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, based on the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to coin money. And the National Geographic guy let him get away with it. Coining money means taking metal and stamping it into little discs that if you dropped on a hard floor would go clinkle, or it would go clank, or something like that. Try that with paper. Doesn't happen, does it? Can you coin paper? Has anybody ever coined paper? Well, then what they're doing is wrong. Yes, what they're doing is wrong. Right. And where did that $100 million come from? And what did that do to your money that you hold? It made it less valuable. And they do it all the time. And not only do they create it, and then they give it to government to buy the bonds, then they accept the interest on the bonds. Oh, what a deal. Don't you wish you could do that? Well, I've got other chapters. I've got chapters on entitlements. The greatest of the entitlements, of course, is the Social Security system. And all by itself, the Social Security system can destroy this nation. So what do we do about it? Why don't we look south? We look down to a nation called Chile. And what do we see? We see that in 1973 they had a much more onerous Social Security system than we have. They even had a health care program. And it was consuming almost 50% of everybody's salary, and the returns they were getting on it were terrible, minuscule. And so the generals took over the country, which is not what I recommend here. I don't want generals taking over. We go back to the Constitution. But the generals took over, and what did they do? They privatized the Social Security system. And they said to the people, look, you go ahead and you invest in your own program here, and all kinds of programs immediately sprang up, and it cost the people less, and all the money they put into it was then available for industry to borrow and to build, and Chile took off. Chile is now the envy of all of Latin America's neighbors. And the Reader's Digest ran an article about Chile not too long ago and said, Chile is el boom. And couldn't that be done here in America? And it could be done tomorrow if we had enough people in the Congress of the United States who are willing to do it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked a lot here about the problems. It's time to get to the solution. What then is the solution to our problems? Well, we go back to the Constitution again. And this time we go to Article 1, Section 7, and one sentence where it says, all bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House of Representatives. I contend that the essence of brilliance is simplicity. And here is a simple way out of the dilemma that we're in. We refer to that. If all bills for raising revenue must originate in the House, and we can get enough good people in the House who will stop funding this and that and foreign aid and the UN and the Department of Education and the Bureau of this and the Commission of that, there's nothing the Senate can do about it. There's nothing the President can do about it because all bills for raising revenue have to originate in the House. And so the deal here is to get 218 good members of the House of Representatives. Okay, how do you do that? Well, let's continue with the simple program. The simple program is to put out trim bulletins. Trim bulletins all over the country, reporting on the congressman. Did he vote for higher taxes and more government? If so, he gets all X's in the right-hand column. If he votes for lower taxes and less government, he gets all stars in the next to right-hand column. And we put these out for all 435 congressmen. And anybody can buy them, and anybody can reproduce them, and anybody can distribute them to let the people in their community know what's going on and what the congressman is doing. And we don't tell people to vote for him or don't vote for him. We don't even say if they're Republicans or Democrats. I contend that there might be some people who like high taxes, and if so, they'll vote for this guy. Sam Jensen of Connecticut. Every chance he gets, he votes for high taxes and more government. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Gephardt of Missouri. Every chance he gets, he votes for high taxes and more government. And he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Rostenkowski from Chicago. Everybody's heard of Rostenkowski. Eh? He voted once the correct way. He got 1 star. I think he got paid off for that one. Right? There are people who say you can't vote the way Trim wants to get stars. And of course the standard is the Constitution. You can't do it and still get reelected. Not so. This fellow Stump from Arizona did so. He got reelected. Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, and he got reelected. Crane from Illinois, and he got reelected. Right? How about here? How about here in Oklahoma? What do we got? Well, here's Dave McCurdy. He got 1 star, but mostly X's. Right? He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He ought to belong in Massachusetts, for crying out loud. Look at this guy. All stars. Istuk from Oklahoma. Now let me show you what can happen. In 1992, a congresswoman from the Missouri area was voting for high taxes and more government almost every single time. Here's a sample of her trim bulletin. Joan Kelly Horn. And the people in that area distributed these by the tens of thousands. They come out 3 times each year, different issues each time, but the issues are the same for all 435 congressmen. And so she got her district papered with trim bulletins. And the people decided at 1992 election to pick somebody else. And the man they picked, his first trim bulletin came along, and look at that. Straight stars. Can it be done? In Iowa, they redistricted. And as a result of redistricting, 2 congressmen were pitted against each other for 1 seat. One of them was a high-taxing, big-spending Democrat. The other was a protect the people's purse Republican. The trim bulletins were diametrically opposite. And so the people in the community simply took out a big ad in the local newspaper, put the 2 trim bulletins side by side with no comment. Guess who won? Yeah. The low-taxing guy won. Over in Alabama, here's a congressman. He got 2 stars, but that was the best he ever did. He most of the time had all X's, and they papered the town with his, and the new congressman in 1993 came forward with all stars. It can be done. It's a simple and brilliant plan to take back our country from those who are destroying it. Now, up in Virginia, they have a really big trim committee, so they have a really big trim bulletin up there, see? Huh? And this guy's all X's. And I thought that was as big as you could get until I went to North Carolina, where they have a really big trim committee, and it keeps growing. They get bigger and bigger. And you know what happened in North Carolina? There are 3 congressmen whose districts have been papered with trim bulletins, and their records are about similar to this guy. And all 3 of them have announced that they've had it. They're retiring. They're not going to run. They're not going to face the music anymore. Can trim do the job that we need done? Remember that trim does not ask anybody to vote for this one or that one. It just puts out the report card, and you then choose, and people all across the country say to us, well, now I understand what my congressman is doing. Up till now, all I've heard is what he's saying. Trim can save the United States of America. Trim can terrorize Congress. Isn't that a delightful way of looking at it? And down the road, after we get a lot more congressmen who are willing to stand by their oath to support and defend the Constitution, then we write a letter to every senator on trim stationery, and we say, Dear Senator, hello, stand by trim. And we start terrorizing the senators. Can it be done? You know it can be done. I've shown you it can be done. I love to talk about the story of the 2 young sisters up in Maryland who went to a congressman's town meeting, and they were passing out trim bulletins, and the record of that congressman was about like this one. They were out on the sidewalk, and as people came by, they'd hand them one, and all of a sudden, the aide to the congressman came out, and he said, you can't do that, you're breaking federal law, get out of here. And they didn't know any better. So they packed up and they walked across the street. There's a fellow standing across the street, and he said, gee, what's all the commotion about? I saw what happened here. I said, well, we're just trying to pass out the report cards on a congressman, and they said we were breaking the law. We don't want to do that. We don't break the law. Oh, he says, may I have one of those? He says, of course. We're trying to give them to everybody. Thank you very much. Off he went. Turned out he was a reporter for the newspaper. The next day, instead of 75 people getting a trim bulletin at the meeting, 7,500 homes got one. He reproduced it in the newspaper. Everybody can be effective. Ladies and gentlemen, the job can be done. We talk a lot about the problem. Yes, the problems are there. We don't dwell on the solution because it's such a simple solution. Let me give you some hope for the future. I promised somebody today I'd talk about hope. I got 5 reasons for hope. We don't allow the word discouragement. In what can we find hope? Well, we can find hope in this, that if we do something that's good and honorable and decent and important, we can count on God to help us if we ask Him. But if we ask God to help us without doing our share, I think God would be angry about that. My mother always said God helps those that help themselves, and that's good advice. Don't anybody presume on God. That's a dangerous thing to do. Be like the farmer who prayed for good crops while he was hoeing. There's hope there. We can ask God for help if we do our share. If we do what we can up to the point we can do no more, then we ask for His help. I think He'll help us because what we're doing is honest and good and true. Another reason for hope, history is made by the majority, the dedicated minorities. Always the case. Throughout the course of mankind, history has been shaped by a very few here and a very few there, usually for bad. Why not for good? If some men can do this, why can't other men undo it? And it doesn't take tens of millions. It takes more than we have, which is why we want you to join the Birch Society. Another reason for hope, there's more good people than bad. Who wants to be a slave? All those want to be a slave, raise your hand. If we continue the way we're going, that's what's going to happen. And good people don't want to be slaves. So let's mobilize them, get information into their hands, and good people will help if you show them that there's a program that can produce results. Another great advantage we have, another reason for hope is we've got truth on our side. What a boon! It takes half an ounce of truth to overcome 10 pounds of falsehood, or tons of it. And we've got truth on our side. And the 5th reason for hope, it's a conspiracy. It's not the evolution of historical forces that nobody can stop. Some men are doing this. Others can undo it. And strange as it may seem, the fact that it is a conspiracy is a reason for hope. So there's plenty of hope. And there's a practical, simple, workable plan. And of course, those who will get involved in doing this trim work will probably be the members of the John Birch Society in leadership. And the energy for them is their knowledge that it is indeed a conspiracy and that it's racing toward its ultimate conclusions. If we don't stop them soon, we will run out of time. Well, let me wind this all up by telling you about Michelangelo. Michelangelo lived over 400 years ago. And Michelangelo, at one point, was working on a 14-foot-high block of marble, and he had his hammer and his chisel, and he was chinking away at it. And there was a boy in the neighborhood that came by to see him. And he'd look in, and he'd see Michelangelo chinking away. And he'd come back the next day, and there's Michelangelo still doing it. And day after day, he's still there, and he's chinking away, and the boy finally throws up his hand. He says, this guy's crazy. He's getting nowhere. And he stopped coming by. And then about a year and a half later, he decided to peek in again and see what was happening. And he looked in, and there was the magnificent statue of David. And the boy, in all honesty, looked at Michelangelo and he said, how did you know he was in there? And Michelangelo knew because he had a vision. And the vision spawned the labor, and it made up for the time and the effort and the seemingly endless frustration and all that work for so long with so little to show for it. But then it began to take shape, and then he rounded it off, and then he polished it up, and then there was the statue of David. Because Michelangelo was willing to work hard enough and long enough and smart enough to see his vision become a reality. We in the John Birch Society have a vision too. We have a vision of the Congress of the United States back under the Constitution. The people who have sworn an oath to it living by that oath. The government of the United States shrinking. The debt being paid off. Us handing to our children and our grandchildren a free country with momentum behind it to be more free. That's our vision. I hope you share that vision. I hope you'll help us to make it a reality. It can be done. If there's any message I give you, it is that it can be done. So let's do it. Thank you very much.